Liquidations are used in practically every single DeFi protocol there is. And so, of course, today we are going to go through the ultimate guide to everything that you need to know about liquidations. And as a part of that, we're going to cover 13, yes, literally 13 different edge cases, vulnerabilities, bugs, and just potential mishaps that can occur with liquidations across all kinds of DeFi protocols. And then after we cover those 13 things, as well as the basics of liquidation and everything that we need to know to even start to understand these edge cases, then at the very end, I'm going to share with you a very, very cunning, complex, and really just a stunning attack vector that if you end up finding it in one of the contests that you compete in, I can pretty much guarantee you're going to have the best finding of the contest. So we're going to go through that advanced attack at the end of the video, so that will be a reward for sticking through watching the entire video. So with that out of the way, of course, before we dive into this ultimate liquidation guide, my name is Owen, and over the past 2 years plus at this point, I've been a co-founder and lead auditor at Guardian Audits. And across those 2 years spent auditing smart contracts, I've easily spent a couple thousand hours reviewing smart contract for security vulnerabilities. And myself and my team have altogether come up with hundreds and hundreds of security vulnerabilities and different types of findings. And we've prevented at least over 100 different critical vulnerabilities at this point. And so my goal with this channel, and especially this video that I'm making today, is to distill down all of the knowledge that I've gotten from the past 2+ years of reviewing smart contracts and give that knowledge to you so that you can ultimately become a much better smart contract security researcher, blockchain engineer, whatever it is that you are looking to be in as little as time as possible. With that out of the way, let's get into this ultimate guide to liquidations. Let's talk about what these 13 liquidation edge cases are. All right, guys. So like I said, in literally pretty much every single DeFi protocol, you're going to see some sort of liquidation logic. So to begin this off, let's just start talking about what is liquidation, right? From a basic view, what is liquidation? And then we can go from there. So liquidation is really just a term for being able to force close somebody's position. So we have this idea of a position, and depending on which DeFi protocol we're talking about, this position can mean one of several things. So for this video, I'm going to break up the different types of liquidation and different types of protocols by borrow/lending liquidation, and then we're going to have sort of like the P&L based, so P&L based, and this is going to be like perps or perhaps options protocols or anything like this. So within these two different subcategories of liquidation types, DeFi protocol types, there's going to be slight differences in the way in which these liquidations work. So in borrow lending, your idea of a position is I basically put down collateral, borrow against it. And so this is your position. Your position is the amount of collateral that you have supplied to the system, and it is the amount of borrowable tokens that you have borrowed against that collateral. Those two things together make up what is your position in a borrow lending platform. And so in a borrow lending platform, we define that we have to liquidate you. We have to force close your position if the value of your collateral is no longer sufficient to support the value that you borrowed. So here we are comparing the value of your collateral with the value of your borrow. And what borrow lending protocols will do is they will not just simply define that the value of your collateral has to be greater than the value of your borrow. We'll define the value of your collateral times some LTV ratio, which is less than 1. So we might have an LTV ratio of 0.80, which is dependent on the collateral token that you supplied. So for example, if I provided USDC as a collateral token, there's a certain risk that USDC could all of a sudden go from $1 to $90, in which case there would be a delta there in the value of your collateral. Now, if we gap below, if we gap from $1 to $90, and we let you borrow up to the limit where your $1 of USDC, all of those USDC, we let you borrow $1 of Bitcoin for every one USDC, then you could borrow $30,000 worth of Bitcoin with 30,000 USDC. And then, well, what happens if one USDC becomes worth 90 cents? Well, then you got $30,000 of Bitcoin, and we are only holding $27,000 of USDC that you've given us. So you'll just walk away with the $30,000 of USD of Bitcoin that you borrowed, and we will be stuck with your only $27,000 of USDC. So we took a $3,000 loss because the price of USDC dipped, and you got to walk away with your $30,000 in Bitcoin. But if we define the LTV here, where we're saying we're only going to allow you to borrow up to 80% of the value of your USDC, not go all the way up to 100%, then once the value of your collateral breaches that 80% threshold, that is when we define when we can liquidate you or force close your position in a borrow lending protocol. And that way there is some padding. There is that 0.20 amount of room between where the LTV is set and where the actual value of your collateral is. And so that padding is so that the borrow lending protocol doesn't have to take on that loss of the $3,000 like in our example. So just to be clear, the position in a borrow lending protocol is based on the borrowed amount and the collateral amount. That is what a position is made up of in a borrow lending protocol. So in a P&L based protocol, which could be something like perps or options, we have a position that is, let's just say for the example of perps, we'll just take perps, or really let's abstract out so we don't even have to worry about the under the hood working of a perpetual futures protocol versus an options protocol or some other protocol. Really, let's just track the collateral. So there will be, just like in a borrow lending, there's a collateral amount. This is similar across both of them. And then there will be some P&L, right? There will be some P&L that is a part of the position that depends on, if they're longing a token or, if they've taken some kind of put option or whatever options they've taken. The position will have some kind of P&L corresponding to some amount of collateral. And so when a position's P&L goes negative, that means that the position is creating literally losses. The user is not profiting, the trader is losing value, then that value has to come out of the collateral. So often what these P&L based protocols will do is they will define some sort of threshold where, like, hey, if your collateral goes below this amount of size, then you're going to be liquidated. So we'll just leave it abstractly like that. So the liquidation criteria here is if your collateral goes below this amount, and we'll be specific, we'll say collateral minus P&L. So your profit or loss, what outstanding profit you have unrealized or what outstanding loss you have unrealized, that will get added and considered with the collateral and the P&L. So this is the criteria for liquidating in a P&L based DeFi protocol. And we'll say collateral plus P&L. So sometimes protocols will include the positive P&L in a trader's collateral. Sometimes they might not, but always the negative P&L should reduce the collateral amount and reduce it when it's being compared to whatever, the threshold is that is desired by the protocol. That is more protocol specific, but in general, we're going to be considering your collateral plus your P&L. If the P&L is negative, that means you've made losses. And so when you make losses, they come out of your collateral. Whatever is remaining after that should be more than whatever the configured threshold is. And now finally, before we get started with the 13 different edge cases for liquidations, I want to touch on the difference between between a position being insolvent versus a position being liquidatable. So let's first talk about what is insolvency. What does insolvent mean? So when a position is insolvent, it means it literally doesn't have the assets to cover its losses or its debts, depending on which type of protocol it is. So if it is a borrow lending protocol, an insolvent position will be a position that does not have enough collateral to repay or to basically offset the borrowed amount that it has. So quite literally, the value of your collateral is not with any consideration of LTV, it would be less than the value of your borrow. Now this would be an insolvent position. The value of the collateral is literally less than the value of the debt that was taken out against that collateral. Now this is very different than the definition of what is a liquidatable position. So when a position is liquidatable in a borrow lending protocol, then we're going to factor in the LTV and we're going to say that, hey, if the value of your collateral times some LTV that is less than 1 is less than the value that you borrowed, then you're liquidatable. And notice that this second one, this will happen first. This will come first since we are taking this value of the collateral, multiplying it by something less than 1, reducing it, so the reduced value of the collateral, and comparing that to your borrowed amount. This will become less than the borrowed amount before this will become less than the borrowed amount. And so remember, this is liquidatable and this is insolvent. So the whole point of adding the LTV ratio for borrow lending protocols is so that we don't reach the point of insolvency, because always, the point of insolvency is bad for a protocol. Because if you go even a little bit beyond the point of insolvency, every dollar that you go beyond what the value of the collateral is in terms of borrowed amount is basically dollars of loss that the protocol will just have to take on, because you're just going to walk away with the borrowed amount. That debt is never going to be fully repaid because your collateral is not sufficient to repay it. And so the protocol will just take that on as bad debt. It's debt in the system that just can never be repaid unless somebody manually comes in and somebody else repays that extra amount, basically as charity. So now let's talk about insolvent versus liquidatable in the context of P&L based protocols. So here, let's take the definition of what is liquidatable. So here's our liquidatable thing. I'll just put liquidatable here. If our collateral plus P&L goes below this amount, so I'm just going to say X goes below X, whatever the certain protocol configuration is, that's what defines whether something is liquidatable. Whether it is insolvent, so let's write insolvent here. Well, this means that X is 0. Right? So if I have $10 of collateral and I have $10 of losses, then collateral plus P&L, 10 plus negative 10 equals 0. I have exactly 0 net value of my position. Now, if I have $10 of collateral and $15 of losses, I have negative 5 net value in my position, negative $5 of net value. And so that would be an insolvent position for a P&L based protocol. And again, with this liquidatable definition, that is everything that we are trying to do, is we're just avoiding the insolvent case, right? We always want to make sure that X is higher than 0 and ideally pretty significantly higher than 0, so that there's no way that the price of a token that they're longing or shorting can immediately gap within a couple of blocks and cause the position to go from totally solvent, not even liquidatable, to boom, P&L drops, and now all of a sudden that position is not only liquidatable, but also insolvent. We do not want to allow that to happen, because when a position goes insolvent, it means the collateral that is sitting there in the position literally cannot cover the losses that that position made. And so you basically just allowed that trader to gamble with free money, right? They took on losses and they literally never repaid their losses. They were only able to pay a portion of those losses, which was whatever collateral amount they did have. So that is the difference between, first of all, the two different types of liquidations and borrow and lending protocols and P&L based protocols. And then there's the difference between insolvent and liquidatable. And this is what they look like in both of those different types of protocols. So with all of that out of the way, let us dive in and let's have a look at the 13 different liquidation edge cases, vulnerabilities, and just mishaps that can come up and that you should be looking for when you're looking at a liquidation functionality. Okay, so let's start off with number one here, and this is going to be a liquidation reverts due to blacklisted tokens. So first of all, you're going to see a lot of these cases are going to be having to do with causing a liquidation to revert. So like we discussed, it is critical that liquidations are able to happen, and they're able to happen in a timely fashion because we want to minimize the risk of positions reaching this insolvent state in either of these protocol types, so that we can minimize the chance that a protocol has to take on bad debt, that a protocol can't cover a user's losses with their collateral, so that the system actually functions as it is meant to, and traders can't like game the system or anything like this. So it is imperative that liquidations go through and they do not revert. However, many of these are going to be different particular ways in which we can cause liquidations to revert, which can, as a second order consequence, cause the protocol to accrue bad debt, to not be able to cover the trader's losses with their collateral, and just really many bad things come of this. So remember that first of all is generally liquidations should never errantly revert. And now let's have a look at many ways in which they will. So the first of which being blacklisted tokens. So usually at the end of a liquidation function, especially in the P&L based protocols, especially in perpetuals or options or something like this, when you close out a position, it will usually close out the entire position, and it will just attempt to send whatever the remaining collateral amount is back to the owner of that position. So the issue with this, of course, is if the owner of that position happens to be blacklisted for the token that is being used as collateral. So we can have a look at a very basic implementation of like a perpetuals protocol, which will show us. So if we call this liquidate function, we're going to go into decrease position, and I'm going to ignore all of this logic. It's not too important, but we see at the end here, there is a safe transfer to the trader, so the owner of the position, of the output amount. And so this is whatever remaining collateral there was, whatever profit might have been unrealized at the time. But the important part is we're going to transfer the asset, so the collateral that is being used, to the trader. Well, in this particular system, the collateral is USDC. Now, you might remember that USDC has a blacklist. We can see, looking at the implementation contract for USDC here, the fiat token V2_1 contract, we can see that it is inheriting from a blacklistable contract, which of course has a mapping from address to Boolean of whether or not this address is blacklisted. So addresses can be blacklisted with the blacklist function. It can be unblacklisted. And of course, only a blacklister trusted account can choose whether something is blacklisted or unblacklisted. But importantly, if we check this modifier, not blacklisted, and see where it is used, then we can see that in the mint function, approve function, transfer from function, and the transfer function, which we're using here, it requires that not only is the message sender not blacklisted, they can't be true in that blacklisted mapping, but also the to address cannot be blacklisted in that blacklisted mapping. So here, when we attempt to transfer the USDC asset to the trader, well, if the trader happens to be blacklisted here, then this transfer is going to revert. So usually what will happen is the only roadblock to get this attack to happen is that you have to get that collateral token into the position to begin with in the first place. Now, one obvious, really simple way is if the account is not blacklisted before it creates a position, and then as the position already exists, the account then becomes blacklisted. And then from that point on, the position cannot be liquidated. But of course, that requires the account knowing that they're going to be blacklisted, which is, maybe not that probable unless they had an attack planned up on a different protocol and they knew they were about to get blacklisted or something like this, but not entirely conceivable. So usually what you'll find in especially complex perpetuals protocols is that some other address will be able to provide collateral for another account's collateral amount. And so some other person can provide that collateral to the trader. And that way that's an easy way to get collateral into the system without having to literally have it come from a blacklisted address. But still on the liquidation, then you would be able to get this to revert because we're still trying to send it to the trader. Okay, so that was number 1. Let's talk about number 2 here. So liquidation reverts, this time due to 0 transfers. So some ERC20 tokens will actually revert upon a 0 transfer amount. And this might make sense from the ERC20 token perspective, because if 0 tokens are being transferred, then that literally doesn't change any state, and so they choose to just revert or specifically not allow it. And so here we can see there is actually a second issue with this same exact line, and that is because, well, what if the output amount here is 0? And often it will be in the case of this function. So in this case, this is another way in which this liquidation would revert, because we are attempting to transfer a 0 amount. Now, also just a reminder that many tokens will also revert when you attempt to send stuff to the 0 address, which is another possible way which you might be able to get liquidations to revert, although I haven't seen that particular edge case cause a liquidation to revert just yet, but that might be a particular edge case as well. Okay, so number 3 here is that isLiquidatable, or whatever commensurate function they have to check whether a position should be liquidated, does not account for fees. So whenever you're checking if a position is liquidatable, whether that's a view function or if it's being checked, it ought to be checked in the liquidate function itself, then we need to make sure that we update the fees that the position is owed. So usually in like a borrow lending protocol, there will be some kind of interest fee that accrues over time. Likewise, in P&L based protocols, there's often a borrowing fee that also accrues over time. There's also funding fees, and there are multiple types of fees. Now, all of these fees should be correctly updated and accounted for when we're trying to tell if a position is liquidatable. So where you see the logic to check if the value of somebody's collateral times the LTV is less than the value of your borrow, we should be updating the fees and reducing the collateral amount right there in that logic. And similarly, for the P&L based protocols, when we're checking if the collateral plus the P&L goes below the configured amount, there should also be fee logic there to reduce the collateral or reduce the P&L, however that logic wants to work. But if we see, and we can go ahead and check the implementation of is position liquidatable here in our minimum perps protocol, and we can see that we are very careful to account for borrowing fees. And you can tell that there are a lot of different cases here. We've got an if special case here, some special cases here. There's a lot of different edge cases, and it is quite tricky, especially as you add more and more different types of fees and stuff like this, to correctly account for all of the different kinds of fees in the protocol. So that is the third thing to check for, is that when we are checking if a position is liquidatable, we should be updating the fees. Now, related to this, somewhat related, is that number 4, the liquidation should be collecting the latest fees. So just like we should be updating the fees to check whether a position is indeed liquidatable, well, the liquidation should also be collecting the latest fees. So if a position gets liquidated and they end up avoiding paying their interest rate or paying their borrowing fees, then that is an issue, right? The liquidation should still take the fees, whether it be interest or borrowing or funding or whatever it might be, should still take those fees from the user. Okay, number 5 here is that a liquidation reverts when a position becomes insolvent. So insolvency is always an interesting edge case to look for. You should always, literally always, examine the liquidation logic to see if there are some interesting edge cases when something becomes insolvent. So again, we discussed in detail what the definition of insolvency is relative to the definition of is something liquidatable. And oftentimes it is surprising the amount of times where once a position does reach a state of actually being insolvent, where the value of the collateral is less than the value that they've borrowed, or the collateral is literally less than the amount of losses, this will often result in some kind of revert, or at the very least a misaccounting in the liquidation. But most often what we see is a panic revert as the result of this. And this is usually because we're trying to literally subtract the borrowed amount from the collateral, or subtract the P&L from the collateral. And of course, if the P&L is of greater magnitude than the collateral, then this will just panic revert, underflow, revert. And so that will prevent the liquidation from happening. And we can see in our minimum perps protocol, we have a very specific case for when the P&L is negative and the position loss is, if it's ever greater than the amount of collateral in the position during a liquidation, then we have a special case to allow insolvent liquidations to still go through. Because if we do somehow reach this state, even though ideally liquidation should happen on time and this should never actually happen, we do still want to definitely be able to liquidate that position. And so there is a special case to handle that. Now, often protocols will not have a special case to handle that. You'll end up with some kind of revert or some kind of wacky accounting, and we absolutely do not want that. Even though it should be, in theory, a rare occurrence, we want to handle it just the same. And you'll see the same thing with borrow lending based protocols, where if the collateral value of a position is less than the actual debt of a position, oftentimes there you'll either see a panic revert or some kind of weird accounting if they haven't specifically handled that scenario. Okay, number 6 here is going to be somewhat similar, is that the liquidation reverts when a position cannot cover the fees. So there are often two types of fees, at least two types of fees that you'll see during liquidation. So there's the normal protocol fees. So that might be your interest fees, borrowing fees, funding fees, whatever they might be. But there's also the liquidator fee. So what is the fee that is being given to a liquidator, somebody who is calling the liquidate function, to actually make this liquidation happen and close these positions? There's got to be some sort of incentive to make that happen. Otherwise, liquidations won't occur in time. So it is a possible edge case that the position collateral is literally not big enough to cover this liquidation incentive fee or the normal position borrowing interest fees, whatever they may be. So those are similar to what we just talked about, where the position literally couldn't cover their losses. And they also deserve a specialized edge case handling. And like we can see, we have that exactly here. So I've got, for example, the pending borrowing fees. And if the borrowing fees are literally greater than the amount of collateral in the position, e.g., we cannot cover all of the fees, and this is a liquidation, then we're going to handle that very specifically. We're going to actually still allow this liquidation to go through. We're just going to cover as much of the fees as we can, set the collateral amount to 0, and then continue on with the liquidation. And here we can see in this protocol, there is actually a vulnerability here that is later on in this list, but we actually do handle the case where there's not enough collateral amount gracefully here for the liquidation fee, because the liquidation fee is a percentage of the remaining collateral amount after these protocol fees have been taken. So even if the collateral amount is 0, then the liquidation fee will just be 0, and this will not end up reverting. Now, however, if this is 0, then remember our edge case here of a 0 transfer amount. So if it ever is zero, then if this asset token happens to revert on zero transfers, then this will indeed cause a revert in the liquidation, and that is an issue. Now, there's actually another issue here, which is a little bit later on in the list, and we'll come back to in just a couple minutes. But as we can see, this handling of all of these different fees can get very hairy, and there's very, very tricky edge cases surrounding getting all of these things to work correctly and not making zero amount transfers and making sure to not revert with an underflow or something like this. So this goes to show exactly why liquidations are perhaps the best area to zoom in on in any code base if you want to find the highest number of vulnerabilities. Okay, and so number 7 here is going to be liquidations revert due to accounting error. So this is just going to be a more general statement about any logic in a liquidation function that could potentially cause the liquidation to revert, any kind of underflow, any kind of validation failure that can occur. These things will prevent a liquidation from happening, and they'll be, more on a more protocol specific, implementation specific basis, but those are still very, very bad edge cases that prevent liquidations and increase the chances of bad debt, protocol losses, etc., etc. Okay, number 8 here is that liquidations do not prioritize the lowest LTV asset. So this one is specific for borrow lending protocols, and specifically for borrow lending protocols that allow positions to have multiple types of collateral. So if I want to provide 10 USDC as collateral, I want to provide 0.05 ETH as collateral, and I want to provide 50 USDT as collateral, then I can provide those 3 things, and I'll have, the summation of whatever, $150 or whatever that's worth of my collateral in aggregate. Now, if I'm liquidating and I'm determining which collateral of these in the basket to liquidate, you want to start off with the lowest LTV assets first. Now, why is this? Well, this is ultimately going to create a stepwise jump. So let's talk about the value of the basket of collateral, or the borrowable amount. So let's say borrowable amount for a position. Now, the borrowable amount for a position is going to be based on the value of the collateral times the LTV for each of the collaterals. So a USDC might have a collateral LTV of 0.8, and Ethereum might have a collateral LTV of 0.6, and a USDT might have a collateral LTV of 0.75, right? All 3 of these tokens have different LTV ratios. And so if I have $1,000 in USDT, my borrowable amount is 800. If I have $1,000 in USDT, my borrowable amount might be 750 based on that LTV ratio. And if I have $1,000 in Ethereum, then my borrowable amount will be 600. And so $1,000 in USDC is not the same as $1,000 in Ethereum, is not the same as $1,000 in USDT when we're talking about using these 3 different collateral tokens. So if we have that borrowable amount value on the y-axis, time on the x-axis, then the value, let's say I have, I've got all 3 of these tokens as collateral in my basket of collateral that is backing my borrowed amount. And let's say the price of Ether is, slowly dropping. And then all of a sudden we hit the line at which all of a sudden our position becomes liquidatable. And then we do get liquidated at this time right here. So let's say right here at this point, we do get liquidated. For whatever reason, this protocol doesn't require a full liquidation. We only do a partial liquidation, which happens in many protocols. And this is actually similar to a finding that we had in a real protocol. Now, what happens if we take the lower LTV assets out of the basket and repay a portion of the debt? Well, then we took the most volatile assets. We took the assets that were being valued the lowest on the borrowable amount scale, and we left the higher LTV assets. So the assets that actually per dollar value allow you to borrow the most amount. And so the borrowable amount after this liquidation, in that case, would immediately improve because we removed the lowest LTV assets. And so the overall average LTV of the basket went up. But if we did the opposite and we removed the higher LTV assets, so the more blue chip assets in a basket of collateral, then the LTV here would go down in a stepwise fashion during the liquidation. So let's say, we've got our 1,000 USDC, we've got our 1,000 ETH, 1,000, let's say these are all dollar values, $1,000 of ETH, $1,000 of USDC, $1,000 of USDT, and we'll remember 0.80. And so the average LTV of my basket here, based on these all being equal dollar amounts, is 0.71667. And so what I'm doing in this case, when I'm removing the higher LTV assets, is I'm taking this USDC and maybe I'm slashing it down to 500 and I'm repaying some of the debt at that LTV ratio with the $500 of USDC. And so now with this weighting of 500 USDC compared to $1,000 of ETH and $1,000 of USDT, my weighted average of LTV goes down to 0.7, which means that per dollar in my basket of collateral, I'm able to borrow less. And so the health of my position, the ratio of my borrowed amount to my collateral value with the LTV actually goes down. So I think a better name for this might be position health. And then remember that this is the ratio of the collateral value to the borrowed amount. And so we'll see actually a decrease. So the liquidation could literally leave the position worse off after the liquidation occurs than the position was before. And we can actually see this exact finding was something that we found in a protocol. We can see ML1 here, health score decreases after liquidation. And we can see in the description, because each token has a different LTV in the collateral basket, a liquidation in a specific token produces a change in borrowing power that is not proportionate to the change in liabilities. And so as a result, you can have a position get a lower health score post liquidation. And we have a specific example here. If you'd like to work through it, you can see how some of the math works out here. And you can see that this does come up oftentimes in real protocols. So that is number 8 here. So let's talk about number 9. So liquidations require too much gas. So this is often going to come up in a similar type of protocol where you're able to deposit multiple different types of collateral tokens to be held in a basket of assets backing your borrowing position. So oftentimes in one of these liquidations, you'll have to loop through the amount of assets that are going to be getting liquidated. We can see in this example liquidate implementation in an example CDP protocol, we're looping through all of the different types of collateral in the protocol. So the protocol uses multiple different types of collateral. And of course, if this loop grows to be too many iterations, then of course this could overflow the block gas limit and then the liquidation could literally never happen. And so this is yet another way to prevent a liquidation from going through. And so this is yet another critical issue. Okay, now number 10 here, let's talk about the liquidation does not prioritize the caller fee. So the caller fee, or like the liquidator fee, is the fee that goes to the liquidator, right? So the person who calls the liquidate function. And this is what incentivizes these liquidations to actually happen. And of course, if the caller fee, the liquidator fee, isn't prioritized in terms of the accounting in which things get distributed, then it's possible that this fee could end up being 0, and thus the incentive to call the liquidate function is going to be 0. And that is, of course, an issue because it means that liquidations will not happen in a timely manner, which means that positions can become insolvent as they're not liquidated in time, leaving the protocol with bad debt, leaving the protocol not being able to cover the trader's losses with the trader's collateral, etc., etc. So we can see an example of this, like we just discovered in our minimum perps protocol here, where the liquidation fee amount could be 0 if this collateral amount was set to 0 in the event that the collateral couldn't cover the borrowing fees, or even the liquidation fee amount might just be so small that it's not worth spending the amount of gas to trigger this liquidation transaction. And so there's not much incentive, if any at all, to cause a liquidator to call the liquidate function. And so this way, there's a lack of incentive for the protocol to successfully operate. And so this is a valid finding. Okay, so number 11 here is going to be liquidations cause users to lose rewards they had accumulated. So for example, if we were to go down, we can see that on line 260 here, when the liquidation goes through and it's left with, no size in tokens and the size in USD, which are not important for us right now, then it goes and it actually deletes the position. So it deletes everything in that position's mapping. It just removes the position from existence. So if we have a look at the position struct, now everything currently on this struct is, maybe completely fine to remove. But what you might see in some protocols is there might be some sort of like rewards accumulated on that position struct. And then of course, if we delete this position, then these rewards that had been accumulated are lost and they can't be claimed by a user with, like a claim rewards function or something like that separately after the liquidation. So this is just one example where a liquidation can occur and it can remove rewards that had already been earned, already been accumulated, and should not have gone away when the liquidation occurred. Okay, number 12 here is going to be that users can force themselves to become liquidatable, and then usually end up just liquidating themselves. So almost always, it is going to be a pretty big issue if a user can force themselves to become liquidatable or just reduce their health to no end. So most commonly they can do this to basically, you can avoid some losses or something if you can intentionally force yourself to become liquidatable and then liquidate yourself, and then you can collect the liquidation reward on top of that. Or a lot of times you might even be able to just straight up game the protocol because of this. And we could see actually in an audit that we did, this was exactly a finding that we found. So if we have a look at port 1 here, which is titled Swap Margin Used to Game the AMM, we can see that users are able to use the swap margin function to siphon funds from their portfolio well past the point of insolvency. So really what this is saying is that there's some way that users are able to cause their position to become less healthy on purpose. So what can happen is a user can sell options contracts to the AMM and collect the premium in their portfolio immediately. And they can repeatedly use this swap margin function, extract value out of their portfolio by themselves intentionally. And then the user wouldn't have any margin remaining in their portfolio to cover any losses or anything like that. And they would just end up liquidating themselves or just leaving their position to be insolvently liquidated. So we can actually have a look at exactly what the swap margin function is here. And really the crux of the issue is that this has a swap inside of it, which of course will give you slippage and fees and stuff like this. So the amount of assets in, the dollar value of that is not going to be equal to the dollar value of assets out. And so the value of this portfolio contract, this is the basket of collateral, is all of the funds sitting in this portfolio contract, is going to be reduced after that swap. And so what is necessary here is some kind of check that the position is still healthy, e.g. not liquidatable, certainly not insolvent. And this is exactly the check that is missing. But there is no check, and so the protocol is allowing anybody to force their position to become liquidatable by making a swap. They can sandwich themselves intentionally and just extract this value out of the portfolio, leaving nothing in there to basically back their actual positions on the AMM. And so that is just one example of where a user could force themselves to become liquidatable, and it ended up in a critical exploit. Now, of course, another famous example of this is the Euler Finance exploit, where a user was given the functionality to donate. They could just donate their collateral to the protocol, and that opened up a door for the user to ultimately donate their collateral to force their position to become liquidatable, and then liquidate themselves and extract value from the liquidator fee because of that. And they're able to use flash loans and all of this stuff to combine that to make that actually really profitable and end up exploiting the protocol for hundreds of millions of dollars because of that. So anytime you see a possible way for a user to force their position to become liquidatable, dig into that, because there is likely an issue there. Okay, and number 13, last but certainly not least here, is that positions in profit can still be liquidatable. So this is a very important edge case to consider and be aware of, and always be checking, is that even if a position is in profit, so mainly this is going to apply to the P&L based protocols, so like perps or options or something like this, where you're tracking P&L for a position. Oftentimes what you'll see protocols assume is they'll assume that when a position is in profit, that it cannot be liquidated, right? Because there's no losses that we have to cover. But that is not the case, right? So a position could have a little minuscule amount of profit and a whole lot of fees that they've got to pay. And technically, those fees could be so large that it actually makes the position liquidatable. And so if you see this assumption being made, then that is obviously something that is wrong in the smart contracts, and it can yield positions actually becoming insolvent literally while they are profitable, yet still not being able to be closed or force closed / liquidated. And even if the contracts do support a position in profit being liquidated, it is an especially interesting case to walk through in the contracts, because oftentimes you'll see an accounting error because of that, which is, like something like number 7. This might be an especially good edge case to walk through and look for things for number 7, like an accounting error that causes an underflow revert or something like this, just because it is an edge case that is so unexpected by protocol teams. And granted, it might be rare, but it is certainly possible, and an attacker could certainly engineer this edge case to come out on purpose. So we can also see in our minimum perps function, when we are decreasing the position, we can see that we're not explicitly requiring that the P&L is positive or negative. In fact, we have an explicit case for if the realized P&L is negative versus an explicit case for if the realized P&L is positive. And so we do still support liquidations in which there is positively realized P&L. Now, if we didn't have this here during liquidations, then, well, we'd be causing people who are liquidated to lose their positive P&L, and that would be a huge issue as well. So you need to be correctly handling all facets of positive P&L, even during liquidations. Okay, so those are the 13 different liquidation edge cases, vulnerabilities, exploits. That was a lot to go through. So first of all, congratulations for making it through all those. I sincerely hope that some of those were new to you, that you'll be able to spot these in the future. If I'm being honest, liquidations are one of the first things that I go to when I'm looking for some critical vulnerabilities, and that is because of this long list of edge cases and vulnerabilities. So now, as promised, I'm going to give you a really, really beautiful attack that can be pulled off on these P&L based systems, specifically that has to do with liquidations. And if you do end up applying this to a contest that you're on, I can almost guarantee you will literally have the best finding in the contest. So without further ado, let's get into this advanced attack here. All right, so to begin this attack, we're going to open a long and a short. So we're going to be long one token and short the same exact token. So that means if the price of the token goes up that we're longing, we're going to make money based on our long position for that. And if the price of the token that we're longing and shorting goes down, then we're going to make money on the short based on that. And then next, you're going to want to find some knob that allows you to make both of these positions unliquidatable until they become insolvent. So what does this mean? Usually what this will look like is like a blacklisted token. So for example, in minimum perps here, if this USDC is blacklisted and we add the correct output amount greater than 0 validation here, then as long as output amount is positive and we're going to be paying something out to the trader, so whatever the remaining collateral is, that's going to go to the trader, then this transaction cannot go through because we're going to be transferring to the trader USDC, but the trader's a blacklisted address for USDC. And so the liquidation can only go through once the output amount reaches 0. And the output amount will reach 0 when there's no collateral left over after the P&L is subtracted, meaning that the liquidation can only go through when the position is insolvent. So blacklisting might be one way they're able to achieve this. Another way might be, just a specific accounting error that you see in the liquidation function, or 0 transfers or something by your design. And so now I claim that we have a risk-free profit strategy just with those two things, with long and short that cannot be liquidated until they are insolvent. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if we draw out the chart of, let's put the collateral value here, and then of course we have time on the x-axis. Let's say this is the actual liquidatable threshold that the protocol has defined, and then this is the actual insolvency threshold. So this is where no longer will we be transferring leftover collateral tokens to the trader because there are no leftover collateral tokens to transfer. And so since we're blacklisted, as the collateral value goes down, let's say we have Ether as collateral, the price of Ether is going down. Normally we would be liquidated when we're in this range, but we cannot be liquidated because we're blacklisted. Well, let's say the collateral token is USDC or something that has a blacklist. Then once we do all of a sudden hit this insolvency threshold, let's say we even gap down, then all of a sudden, let's say right here, that's where we are able to be liquidated. And finally, the liquidation can go through. Now, here's the thing about where we got liquidated is we only had so much collateral to lose, right? We had $1,000 of collateral, and once our P&L equaled $1,000, at that very instant, we became liquidatable. But once that P&L went above $1,000 in losses, then we became insolvent. And so right here, we could say, for example, we had our $1,000 in collateral, but then at this point, we could say we had $1,100 of losses, and that's what we had here. But if I had $1,100 of losses, I can only lose $1,000. So I was only able to pay, so I paid $1,000, right? But I actually lost $1,100 getting liquidated right at this point right here. And let's say this was our long, so this was our long position. And just to be explicit about the collateral value here, what we mean by this in a P&L based protocol is the collateral value really minus the P&L, or plus the P&L, you could say. So we could say we are long on ETH, and the collateral value plus the P&L would go down as the value of ETH decreases. So let's say the price of Ether is decreasing here. I had, remember, $1,000 of collateral value. I am only liquidatable once the P&L reaches minus $1,000. My losses are $1,100. So at this point, they were $1,000 of losses in my P&L. So this is negative P&L. And then right here at this level, these were $1,100 of negative P&L losses. And then, like we said, we can only actually pay $1,000 because that's all we have in collateral. But why is this a risk-free trading strategy? Well, remember, this is our long. This is the price action of our long. Let's look at the price action of our short over the same time period. So I can chart out, here is this, and then we can do the collateral value plus the P&L here. This is going to be the same $1,000. Now remember, at the end, we ultimately got to the point of negative $1,100 when we're liquidated. So this will be the P&L. If the P&L for the long was 1,100, then the P&L for the short is going to be positive. Instead of losses, we get gains, right? So as the value of our long goes down, that means the value of our short looks like this, something like this, if I try to replicate what happened there. So the opposite, a mirror of what happened with our long. The only difference here is that you see on our long, we were capped out. This dotted line right here is the limit of the amount of money that we can possibly lose. I don't have any more than $1,000 of collateral in this position to lose. So at the point where we are at $1,000 of losses, I can't lose any more money. But we weren't liquidated until the point where we were at $1,100 of losses. But here's the thing. At that very point where we are liquidated, I can then come and back run, front run, or just get a transaction in the same exact block at the same exact pricing, and I can close my position right here at a net gain of positive $1,100. And so what I've done is I've capped my downside to only a loss of $1,000. I'm just going to remove this, put that there. Okay, to a loss of negative $1,000. That's my downside. The most I can lose is $1,000. But since the price gapped to a loss of $1,100, I can claim a profit of $1,100 on the opposite position, my short. And so I'll lose $1,000 because that was all of my collateral, and I'll gain $1,100. So my net profit is $100 after all of this, across both my long and my short. So here I realized negative the value of my collateral because I'm capped out at, you can take all my collateral, you can't take any more. But here I'm uncapped, right? I just realize $1,100 of profits. So net result after everything, free $100. And no matter which way the price moves, I'm always guaranteed to be able to get this to happen. And ideally, to make this happen the most often, the easiest to manage and just make the most amount of money, I would do this with really high leverage positions. But this is one of the probably most complex, beautiful attacks that you can find in a system if you are able to prevent a liquidation from happening until you reach the point of insolvency. So watch this back a couple of times and maybe work through it yourself and see how this situation comes to be. But I hope that this was something perhaps new that you hadn't considered, that maybe you'll start looking for in protocols and contests or security reviews that you go through. All right, and finally, of course, if you really like this Web3 security stuff and you're trying to break into the industry and you want to become an elite security researcher in months and not years, I have in the description below a 6-step guide to becoming a senior smart contract security researcher in 6 months. If that's something that you're looking to do, if it's not something you're really interested in right now, then don't click on it. That's totally fine. And then of course, if you're looking to connect with people from across the world, ask any questions you have related to smart contract security, blockchain engineering, or anything like this, then of course we have the completely free community that you can apply to join at lab.guardianaudits.com. I look forward to seeing you in there. And of course, I can't wait to see you next time.